In the last lesson, we talked about how to prove triangles are congruent, and we were able to prove triangles are congruent using side, side, side. You should know these by now. Side, 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 angle, side, angle, and angle, angle, side, which also can be written as side, angle, angle. Once we know two triangles are congruent, we can use that to prove some other things. So we're going to remember that once we know the definition of congruent triangles is that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, and we abbreviate this CPCTC. So these are one and the same. CPCTC and definition of congruent triangles, they're one and the same. The corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. We could say the 6 corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. But the idea is once we know that two triangles are congruent, we know their corresponding parts are congruent. So as we look at these 4 things up here, we know that to prove two triangles are congruent, we really only need 3 pairs of corresponding parts for these. So if we were to prove something true by one of these, we know that the other corresponding parts are congruent. So just for example, and try to understand this a little bit better, since triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ by side, side, side. So take a look at that, realize it's 3 sides of this triangle are congruent to 3 sides of the other, so these 2 triangles are congruent. What other congruent statements can we write? Well, now that we know the triangles are congruent, we know that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So therefore, we can write other things that are congruent. Well, here we have 3 sides congruent to 3 sides. Well, besides the 3 sides, there's 3 angles. So the other things that we can write is we can write angle A is congruent to angle X, because since the triangles are congruent, we know those corresponding parts are congruent. Angle B is congruent to angle Y, because since the triangles are congruent, the corresponding parts are congruent. So B is congruent to Y. And the last one we can write here is angle C is congruent to angle Z. Again, because the 2 triangles are congruent, the corresponding parts are congruent. So in proofs, sometimes we prove 2 triangles are congruent in order to show that some other thing, whether they be segments or angles, that's what it is usually, but sometimes we'll use these with other triangles and circles, are also congruent. So let's do one example of this. This example does not give you the statements and reasons. In fact, where I got this from, they use conclusions and justifications, but this is the same idea as statements and reasons, if that makes you feel more comfortable. And so we're going to work through this one, and we're going to prove, we want to prove that SA, that's this segment. So let's just highlight this. This is, in the long run, we want to prove SA is congruent to PA. So there's a P that got cut off a little bit. So we want to prove those two segments are congruent. They're not proven yet. I'm just putting it there, so that's our goal. And so to start this off, the idea here is hopefully we can prove this top triangle is congruent to this bottom triangle, and if those 2 triangles are congruent, then we know that their corresponding parts are congruent. And so we'll start off with our given. We're going to write SH, segment SH is congruent to segment PE, and at the same time we can write angle S is congruent to angle P. How do we know that's true? Well, it's told to us. It's given. So that's given. And we can number these. So that's our first thing. Alright, and again, once we put something in our proof, we can mark it. So SH, that's this segment here, is congruent to PE. Also, angle S is congruent to angle P. And so far, we have a side's congruent to a side and an angle's congruent to an angle. What else do you notice here? There's something that you should definitely pick out. In fact, it helps you because it marks it. And so we see here that we have vertical angles, and anytime we have vertical angles, we know that vertical angles are congruent, so we can write angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Why can we write that? Because vertical angles are congruent. We know they're congruent, so I'm going to mark them congruent. So I'll put this with a double arc. And now looking at this, we have two angles of one triangle and a non-included side congruent to two angles of another triangle and a non-included side. So we can write that these two triangles are congruent. I actually know my reason is going to be angle, angle, side, or if some of you like side, angle, angle. Now I want to write this correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and put this first triangle, and I'm going to do alphabetical order, so triangle A, H, S is congruent to, and we want to line this, put this correctly, angle A, the angle formed at A is actually congruent to the angle formed at A here in the bottom triangle. And then we went from A to H. Well, that one, AH, corresponds to AE, so we'll go E next, and then our last letter P. And so we know those two triangles are congruent by angle, angle, side. And now this is kind of the new part. Since the two triangles are congruent, we know that all corresponding parts are congruent. And so we know that this SA, we can get to what we wanted to prove, SA is congruent to the corresponding part PA. And now the reason that is typically put here is the abbreviation CPCTC, although you have to know that what that stands for, so just a reminder, that is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And so that's written in your notes, but make sure you know that. Another thing, you could also put definition of congruent triangles. But CPCTC is an often used abbreviation for that.